I'm James Priest of The Referent, and this is the Brewer to Brewer podcast from All About Beer. My guest is Marika Josephson, and she is here for a conversation that goes beyond the brew house and into topics that matter to brewing professionals and curious beer drinkers. First, please visit allaboutbeer.com and follow on social media at All About Beer. And to support journalism in the beer space, check out patreon.com/allaboutbeer. We'll get into the conversation in just a moment, but first, this message.
This episode is brought to you by Osmanthus Flowers. Osmanthus radiates fresh floral spring like no other flower. Add Osmanthus to lambics, lagers, pilsners, wit beers, or other Belgian styles. First Tea is your source for Osmanthus and teas that fit the unique flavor profiles you're looking for. Email info@firsttea.com, that's FIRSDTEA, to discover the perfect teas and botanicals for your next project.
For more than a decade, the Beer Law Center has been dedicated to the craft beverage industry, meeting the legal needs of breweries, wineries, distilleries, and all manner of alcohol producers and sellers around the country. From company formation to federal and state licensing, trademarks, regulations, and compliance, or if you're buying or selling an alcohol business, the Beer Law Center should be your first call. The firm never charges for an initial consultation, and if they can't help you, they'll help you find someone that can. Have a legal question? Contact the Beer Law Center on social media at Beer Law Center and online at beerlawcenter.com.
Ironheart Canning is the quality leader in mobile canning and much more. With a decade of packaging experience, Ironheart is your turnkey solution for all your canning needs. Ironheart has no minimums on their mobile service, great supply chain quality control like no other, as well as technical support programs. Need canning materials? Ironheart has you covered with cans by the pallet or the trailer load, Pactex case trays, and can ends as well. Ironheart Canning. You have the capability because Ironheart can do it for you. Visit them at ironheartcanning.com or email info@ironheartcanning.com.
Malteurop Malting Company is based in North America, specializing in growing and producing quality malts for the craft beer and distilling industries. With local farms and malt houses spread across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, MMC's commitment to excellence is fully ingrained into every batch it produces, ensuring breweries and distilleries of any size can create the finest beverages on the planet. Visit malteuropmaltingco.com to learn how Malteurop can support your malting needs. Or you can contact them at customersuccess@malteurope.com or call 844-546-MALT for questions or to place your order. Malteurop, premium grains from field to flavor.
Okay, let's get into it. A bit about my guest today. Marika Josephson is the co-owner and brewer at Scratch Brewing Company, a farmhouse brewery located outside the Shawnee National Forest in southern Illinois. She and partner Aaron Clyden are three-time semifinalists for the James Beard Award and co-authors of the Homebrewers Almanac, a seasonal guide to making your own beer from scratch. Thanks so much for joining me today, Marika. How are you doing?
Thanks, James. I'm very honored to be here. Thanks for the conversation. I'm doing good. How about you?
Doing pretty well. As we, just spoke, I feel like to give anybody else context, we had never met prior to this. I'm just a fairly long-time Scratch enthusiast and fan of what you guys are doing there, including some of the written work, both the Homebrewers Almanac and the kind of collaborative thing with Good Beer Hunting, keeping the farm and farmhouse beer. Manifesto is probably too strong a word, but it's good, kind of call to action. Piece on nomenclature and what constitutes good. I'm not trying to be good, trying to work local. If one is going to make any claims to as such,
right.
And I think I first heard of Scratch. I want to say I was trying to recall this for this podcast. I don't remember what year, but I feel like I heard about some breweries showing up at the Great American Beer Festival with a series of single tree beers. And I wanted to hear from you about, well, I guess if you could first explain what those beers are, why you make them, and especially I'm curious what the kind of experience was, if my memory serves, that this was an actual
It was. That was an event that really happened. Yeah.
Yeah.
Both the Great American Beer Festival and the fact that we went with single tree beers. Yeah. We went
Yeah.
we went to GABF once or twice, and we thought it would be fun on like maybe this, I forget, the second or third round to like bring a whole theme of just unusual foraged beer ingredients, beers with, foraged ingredients. And I think that was the first series that we did, was the single tree series, because we also did one with mushrooms, and we did one with without hops at all. That, which was a fun one, because when people would come, whenever people come around to the tables, they're always like, "What's your hoppiest beer?" And we could
Yeah.
say, literally, there are no hops in any one of these beers. Anyways,
How
yeah.
did people how do people react to that? I mean, I'm sure there was varied response, but
It depends on the day, if it's Thursday, Friday, or Saturday, and also
yeah,
the time of the day.
sure, sobriety matters. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But no, overall, actually, I felt like those years that we went where we had brought sort of a theme were the most interesting and successful ones, because I think people were really interested to try all of these unusual flavors that, with those beers in particular in those series, they are very unusual because they have a little bit of a theme, with, especially with, I'd say, even with the single tree beers, and many of which, the trees are, that people know the trees, but they've never had the tree expressed in beer form before. So, it's always interesting, whether we're in our tap room or in an event space like that, to watch people wrap their minds around it. I'm pretty sure that was maybe like year 3 or something that we have after we had opened, because that's when we started to play around with those beers. So this was maybe like 2016. And what inspired that was, we actually started the brewery with a third business partner, Ryan Hochstein, and he had found a recipe for making hickory bark syrup, just in your home, like a simple syrup with hickory bark.
Mhm.
And we jumped on that idea, thought that it sounded really interesting, and thought, well, you're just boiling this and adding sugar to it. How is that any different than just putting it right into wort while you're boiling it? So that's what we did. It tasted fascinating. It was like nothing we'd ever had. So we definitely brought that beer with us, a single tree hickory. And that's one that we actually, of that series, it's the one that we still make most regularly. But it sort of led us down this rabbit hole, I very much remember, of experimenting with trees, kind of for the first time in a really intensive way, where we wanted to see what every single tree bark that was edible tasted like in a beer, or smelled like in a beer. And then two, like sort of expanding that a little bit, what else can you get out of a tree besides just the bark that's going to add flavor, and so those beers became even more kind of refined around this idea of what could you get out of a single tree. So they all had, whatever was edible, whether it was the bark, the leaves, maybe the nuts if they had it, or flowers, or fruit, sap. Potentially the single tree maple had the sap in it. So yeah, just all of the kind of complexity that you can get out of a tree. That's what that series came from, and just an exploration of that.
I love that. So if it took a couple years to get into some of the tree beers, what kind of beers? I mean, I assume it seems so part of at least what Scratch has become, and maybe let's talk a little bit about kind of where it came from. So what kind of beers were going on right when you guys opened? What kind of beers were you producing? And what were some kind of early inspirations, maybe, whether
Yeah,
in the beer realm or otherwise?
we were always experimenting with stuff from the woods from day one. I mean, from like even from like the homebrew days before we got going. But I would say the things that we were experimenting with were maybe the things that were slightly more sort of, I hate to say traditional or conventional, because there's hardly anything traditional or conventional about it, but like say using a persimmon, a wild
Yeah.
fruit that grows in our woods, or a pawpaw or something like that.
Right.
And not so much like dissecting the tree itself and saying like, well, what does a tree bud taste like in a beer? Or
Mhm.
what does a leaf taste like in a beer?
Mhm.
And particularly from things that, you aren't traditionally thought of as edible, because we're not eating it in the beer, we're just consuming it through its infusion into the beer itself.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, so I would say maybe like somewhat more commonly foraged ingredients, something like that, or like acorns, things that are the blockbusters of the foraging world, maybe you would say. And then also a lot of farmed ingredients too. I mean, sometimes that sort of falls out of conversation when people talk about our beer, but there is a lot of stuff that we put into our beer that we grow on our own property, whether it's fennel or ginger or apples. Aaron's gone down himself along rabbit hole of growing apples recently and has stumbled on some really interesting heirloom varieties that have grown around here for a long time.
Very cool.
Yeah, so there is a whole farmed component too, both what we're growing on our farm and what we're getting from local farmers as well.
Yeah, it feels like I was just rereading the Homebrewers Almanac in preparation for this. It feels like it's maybe not quite half and half, but roughly half and half
Yeah,
between like foraged, ingredients from your environment and ones that would require a bit of cultivation if,
yeah,
if only in kind of an herb garden setting or something. But
right. Yeah, for sure. And that was something that it was important to us too, this idea that you can grow ingredients that add, interesting flavor and aroma in your own garden, even if it's just a small garden, or you can get those things from local farmers without having to go too far outside of your neighborhood or your community or whatever. And a lot of those ingredients can add really interesting flavors, so you're not buying as much from quite so far away.
that probably I don't know that I want to just rehash the entirety of keeping the farm and farmhouse beer, but that's a very natural segue into the kind of core tenets of that of I guess like the 5 point the 5 principles of farmhouse
Mhm.
brewing
Yeah.
put forth there. The first of which was growing a significant number of one's own inputs,
Mhm.
and presumably I guess forage things would. I don't know.
Right.
Well, I don't know how you would feel about that. Maybe it's elucidated in,
It's a
but
good open question. Yeah.
yeah, but it's if it's nearby and certainly part of the uh,
Yeah,
part
the
of the
environment
biome. Yeah.
for sure.
And then the second one, which seems like it can be much more broadly applicable, even probably for people who aren't even desiring to call their beer farmhouse beer, is that it should be grown and processed basically as in as tight a radius as one can muster,
Hmm.
regionally. Yeah, at kind of at minimum. I think thankfully we've seen probably I don't know, a great growth in craft and local and regional malting,
Yeah,
even probably since Scratch opened.
for sure.
Um,
Yeah.
so who are you guys working with malt wise these days?
Yeah. We work with Sugar Creek Malt, and we've been working with them essentially since they opened. They're our closest maltster. We work very closely with Caleb and have for a long time. And I feel like this is what's so important about maltsters is, that's a whole entire career in and of itself to make good malt and also to interface with farmers, because the farming side of it is itself a full-time career. um,
Mhm.
and being able to work with them to understand some of the things that need to happen during the growing season to get something that's going to be where it needs to be for malt.
Right.
Yeah, I think having a close partner in somebody like Caleb is just really a key to being able to be more regional. And yes, it has exploded. It's amazing. It's so great to see. We get emails somewhat frequently from maltsters all over that are opening, and I love to see it because I feel like it's really going to help everybody to create a more regional product.
Absolutely. Yeah, we feel the same. We got a handful of local ones here that, yeah.
Yeah, who
It's
do you work
just,
with?
mostly, well, yeah, Hillary at Rabbit Hill in South Jersey. They're, I
Okay.
think, a kind of rare example of people who, yeah, take on that the double pain of being both farmer and maltster.
Yeah.
And there's some more local ones that are, yeah, now that we've moved to Pennsylvania, increasingly local to us, but so we dose them in with some new recipes as well. But
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when we first opened, I'm trying to remember. I think it was like there were like a dozen maltsters in the entire country, you
right,
know. Yeah. I think Riverbend was the closest one to us at that time, which is hard to
in
wrap your
North
mind around.
Carolina, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, wow.
Sure. Um, which yeah, we were getting malt from them for a couple of years, and then Caleb opened, which was great because he's sourcing much closer to our region as well. So our farmers, our part of the country. Yeah. And then, in addition, he's I feel like he has sort of a scratch in, spirit at heart. He's doing so much experimentation with what he's growing as well. I mean, he's also growing a little bit, some of the interesting things he's brought back from abroad. And then, the Soinhoos and some of the other interesting smoked malt projects he's been doing. So it's been fun to work closely with him because, uh, yeah, we're just able to experiment a little bit more.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a kind of, yeah, natural affinity there, which could have been, you could have, yeah, I guess arisen, mutually if you guys are working together, that hopefully it kind of rubs off on one another and, yeah,
Right.
inspires you to
For
do
sure.
more fun, weird local things.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, our land that we're on, it's all wooded around us. So we don't really have a good space to grow grain.
Right.
Um, we have sourced our wheat, like raw wheat, from local farmers. Every year or two, we're able to get a good amount of raw wheat that we can use for some of our wheat beers, which is great. And then we grow corn. We do have a little plot of corn. So that's like the best we can do for grain at the moment, hoping that eventually we'll find a spot that will be good for us to grow more, barley or something.
Yeah, it's tough, and especially when well, there was some, I think I even got it as a pull quote out of that keeping the farm and farmhouse beer. Just the quote is, on the whole, dividing labor has helped us elevate the quality of beer. And that
Yeah.
kind of question of, compartmentalizing and to what extent it's helpful to just kind of focus up, but then make sure to have as good kind of community or local partnerships as you
Right.
can.
Right.
Knowing, I'm sure you feel kind of, yeah, like you were just expressing I don't know, the self-applied pressure to like try to make it work, to try to grow your own
Yeah.
inputs, even when it's maybe not as easy as one would like.
For sure. And I think, a lot of it is just, it's about doing it smartly and thoughtfully, yeah. And realistically too. I mean, as brewers, we only have so much money we can put into, are we going to get a new mash tun, or are we going to look for a plot of land to grow barley on?
Right.
Yeah, you have to make decisions too. And the market's gotten a little smaller
Hmm.
over the years. So yeah.
Certainly. Where, yeah, maybe the price of the mash tun has gone down a little, but also the cost of the land has maybe gone up a little, and yeah,
Right.
doesn't make that decision necessarily any easier.
Right. For sure. Yeah.
The third, just, might as well, because I got questions on this front too. The third principle of the keeping the farm and farmhouse beer is about, it doesn't say natural fermentation, but it's trying to, yeah, trying to what is the exact language? I can pull it up. I just had in a fraught word natural fermentation, but it's
Yeah.
yeah, using the kind of microflora that are um native, or at least without too much have too much
Manipulation.
human exertion or influence, that
Right.
are or I guess especially like kind of laboratory, maybe sterile conditions imposed that can be grown up from naturally occurring microbes there. And so that just I read a little bit about that, like for at least your kind of your sour beer side of things, that was derived primarily from like the pizza kitchens sour and or bread sourdough culture. And I just want to hear more about like the origins of that. If
Yeah.
how you got started with all that side of things.
Yeah. The sourdough was another fun experiment that worked really well for us. Again, something that we experimented with in the homebrew days, made a Berliner Weiss with a sourdough bread culture, knowing that the culture itself is, naturally a mix of lactobacillus and Saccharomyces
Right.
yeast. And sort of figuring that was a good beer to start with, since it generally is kind of a mix of those things. It was really good. It tasted like it was lightly tart, very lightly acidic, very easy drinking. Had this kind of apple and pear notes that were very unusual but pleasant. And so when we started the brewery and we decided to grow this idea up, that was like a 5-gallon batch, and we decided to grow it up to, all of 45 gallons, which was all we were brewing at the time. It ended up being a lot more difficult at a bigger scale. We started this culture in our kitchen at the brewery. We started a brand new one that would just be sort of the brewery culture. It would be, made out of all of the microflora that was floating in our air and the grain that we were using. And it took us a while, because we were using it both for bread and for beer, to kind of understand its life cycle and when it was healthy. And we made a lot of bad beer with it. Trying to understand exactly like when it was healthy, when it was doing what we wanted it to do, and how to feed it to get it to make the best beer. I think it took us like 3 or 4 months of just constant manipulation, both in baking and in brewing, until we realized that, it was healthy at this particular stage. When we grew it up in this particular way, that made good beer, and we needed, this much of a pitch, which felt like we have a lab that we're like measuring out, the yeast and bacteria in there. It's literally just, is it making weird off flavors that allow us to understand that it's underpitched or overpitched, or is it attenuating, all that stuff. And so we kind of hit on like the right recipe for it, which I'm always open about talking about it, because I just think it's so fascinating, really. I mean, this is literally a culture that is made out of flour and water. That is it. Whatever other wild things are in there. You take a scoop off, you add more flour and water to that scoop. And that's what you would do to build up bread. That's exactly what we do to build up a starter for our beer too. Then we put it in a plastic bucket with a lid on top. And then when it's time to pitch it into the fermenter on a brew day, we just take that plastic bucket up a ladder, open up the port or the manway on top of this fermenter, and we dump the plastic bucket full of a flour and water and sourdough culture directly into the fermenter. It sounds crazy.
So it's so simple. I mean, it's like it is and it is. I don't know. I'm right.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's it.
Yeah, we're just doing air. It's
right.
There's all kinds of crazy ways that
right.
Yeast just exists. It's just
It
there.
just exists. It does its thing. It like wants to eat sugar and turn it into alcohol and carbon dioxide. Yeah, I think that like what always amazes me is, we don't sterilize the bucket before we put the culture in. There's a lot of things that feel very unsterile about it, especially for like a modern brewer, I would say,
Oh yeah.
Yeah, we use a wooden spoon to like scoop it out of the bucket to like make sure we get everything into the fermenter.
Right?
Um,
Which could play its own tiny role in the
right,
process. Yeah.
right. But when you taste these beers, and so we use this culture for about, I would approximate 75% of our beer over the course of a year. And
Hmm.
it's not just the sour stuff, it's also like our saisons too,
Gotcha.
and some of our other quote unquote clean fermentations. Um, but what you get out of it when it tastes good is it's a pretty clean fermentation, even on the sour side. So we actually had the culture analyzed in a lab, and we know for certain that it is a mix of lactobacillus and Saccharomyces, and there's like 11 different types of lacto in it. There's
Nice.
no PDO, there's no diastaticus, there's no Brett. None of those things are in our culture. So we're at least pretty confident in the kind of culture that we're pitching into this. And we know kind of what to expect from it as well. We know it's not going to drop all the way down to zero. We shouldn't expect it to do that unless there's something else going on with the beer, some other accident. So it's actually fairly predictable. Its attenuation is pretty predictable.
Where does
Once
it where does it tend to finish on, well, on its most, I don't know, let's say on a very fermentable grist, where does it tend to?
Yeah, it depends a little bit, but it's like maybe 73% or something. It does depend a little bit on, we usually actually try to bump up a simple sugar by adding like honey or something.
Gotcha.
To just help it drop down a little bit more. And it tends to actually want to attenuate a little bit more when we do that too.
Mhm.
But anyway, yeah, it's oddly predictable given how many things seem variable about it and the fact that it
Right.
does seem slightly unsanitary. Yeah, from a brewing perspective.
Yeah, I think when you bring some of these, I don't know, time-honored, generational or millennia-old, artisanal methods to an industry that has become very much that, industrialized.
Mhm.
Yeah, you could feel crazy, or it feels crazy to do some of these things,
Right.
but
But it
also
works.
it works, right? And it feels that much, I don't know, at times more important probably to be doing the work you're doing. Where
Right.
would it
Yeah.
be, would it be lost nearly entirely, or to, yeah, maybe a handful of home brewers? Certainly, yeah, finding um, that kind of scale. I guess you were at, I don't know, right around 300 barrels a year in the as of 2018. I think it probably, other than being able to get local grains, which can scale up, and thankfully there are, some very good regional breweries that can buy a lot of local grain. Feels
Mhm.
like a lot of this is inherently the province of, slightly smaller brewery,
Yeah.
that can, yeah, can afford to work with tiny tiny amounts of inputs that still can be impactful.
Yeah.
So what is a batch? So you said you were at like a 1.5 barrel early on. What
Yeah.
is, not to geek out about, gear for something where it's obviously not like the main point of what you guys do, but yeah, what is the kind of
Our
equipment? I've seen some wood fired kettles and fun things, but
Right. I think our brewery is very embarrassing, and I don't like to have visitors because it's like we
if
got
you don't
these
want
old.
to talk about it, I don't
No, it's
want to.
fine. No, it's like the least sexy part of the brewery is our actual brew house because it's like we got these old like silicone home brewer hoses and like running things outside then back inside, and it's like
Yeah,
I think Aaron counted it, like on a brew day. Then this is not something Aaron would ever do, but like he gets in like 20,000 steps or something. He is
yeah,
not a step counter, by the way, at all.
yeah,
And I want to put that to the lie for sure. He doesn't do that normally, but it's just like it's so labor intensive
yeah.
what we do. It's stupid and silly. And we use these barrels as mash tuns and it's just so much extra work. But anyway, yeah, we graduated up from a jerry-rigged barrel and a half system that we just cobbled together on a shoestring budget when we first opened to a jerry-rigged, cobbled together, roughly 7-barrel system that, like, only former homebrewers probably could have designed. The inefficiency that is built into our system. But yeah, we mash in these silly puncheons, and then we send all of the wort outside to boil in a copper kettle, which is not silly. It's pretty cool. Aaron worked with a copper maker in Virginia to have this built to his own design.
I think we had heard about this, from the Penn Druid brothers.
Yes,
the Carney brothers.
He also made their kettle. Yeah. And their design was different from ours. So we had originally bought, so I don't know, maybe this is too geeky, but we had originally bought a 3-barrel copper kettle from him. At that time, it was the largest kettle that he'd ever made. And it was just for making apple butter. This is like churches, on steroids, used to make apple butter. It was 100 gallons, and we did use it actually it doubled our capacity. We were from like the barrel and a half system that we were on. We had from day one, actually, and this was almost by accident, but before we had our propane and stuff hooked up in the brewery, we had borrowed from an auctioneer down the road. This is so country. A tiny apple butter kettle that he had that was like maybe 40 gallons or something. And we brewed our very first beer on that. And that was a beer de garde, just a standard beer de garde, nothing unusual.
Chanterelles, just normal.
Right. This was just a standard beer de garde, and it was brewed over a wood fire in this copper kettle. And the results were just immediate to our senses. Once it finished fermenting, we could tell that it had a kettle caramelization that was very unusual, that we had never gotten out of any other way that we brewed before. And we thought this was really special. We wanted to keep doing it. We kept that little kettle for a while, used it, graduated up to this 3-barrel one. Then when we decided we wanted to graduate again up to kind of where we wanted to be at with our brew house, so around like the 7 to 8-barrel mark, we called this guy who had made the 3-barrel kettle, and Aaron kind of walked him through a design for basically something that was over twice the biggest size that he'd ever made. Wow. And this design that would hold the kettle up in a stand and be wrapped around it to be able to keep all of the heat inside. So the kettle itself, for all the inefficiencies there are at scratch, the kettle itself is incredibly fuel efficient. So with just a small stack of wood, what we normally keep in like our bread oven or our pizza oven and fire a pizza, we're keeping a beer boiling for 10 minutes. It's pretty amazing how efficient it is with fuel, which is awesome. So we don't use any propane on the boil on a brew day. We're just using that wood fire. And I think you can really taste the flavor, especially in some of our lighter beers, the beer de gardes especially, but also in like just a Pilsner or something. I think it adds a little bit of mouthfeel and complexity the way that you might get from like a decoction or something.
I may have missed it with that first one where you first noticed the difference. Was that one also copper, the smaller? Yes. Okay, so yeah. It does seem magical, copper.
Yeah, it is
something to it.
Cool.
Yeah. So I think we're gonna have to make all of up here a little money. We'll have to take a short break for this message and then come right back for more of this conversation with Marika Josephson.
Brewers across the globe have leveraged the popularity of osmanthus-scented beers. Now, First Tea is bringing that clean, natural flower to North America. Email info@firsttea.com, that's FIRSDTEA, to find out how to use this delicate flower in lagers, wit beers, and more.
For more than a decade, the Beer Law Center has been dedicated to the craft beverage industry, meeting the legal needs of breweries, wineries, distilleries, and all manner of alcohol producers and sellers around the country. From company formation to federal and state licensing, trademarks, regulations, and compliance, or if you're buying or selling an alcohol business, the Beer Law Center should be your first call. The firm never charges for an initial consultation, and if they can't help you, they'll help you find someone that can. Have a legal question? Contact the Beer Law Center on social media at Beer Law Center and online at beerlawcenter.com.
Malt Europe Malting Company is based in North America, specializing in growing and producing quality malts for the craft beer and distilling industries. With local farms and malt houses spread across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, MMC's commitment to excellence is fully ingrained into every batch it produces, ensuring breweries and distilleries of any size can create the finest beverages on the planet. Visit malteuropemaltingco.com to learn how Malt Europe can support your malting needs. Or you can contact them at customer success at malteurope.com or call 844-546-MALT for questions or to place your order. Malt Europe, premium grains from field to flavor.
Welcome back, Marika Josephson, to the Brewer to Brewer podcast, Roll Up Beer. We were just talking about a little bit about equipment, a little bit about yeast before that. Kind of dovetailing a little with the yeast conversation, and that your hopping rates range from none at all, right, in a decent proportion of maybe some of the sour beers to, using them in others, and using all kinds of different herbs that to me exist on some unfathomable spectrum of antimicrobial, but I guess especially antibacterial potency. I'm just wondering if you and Aaron have ever kind of formally or informally charted this, or how you conceive of the amount of antibacterial power. I think in the Homebrewers Almanac you say it's never going to be quite what hops deliver, but I know for certain of these kind of old gruit herbs that's still part of the point, and they can do a decent bit of inhibition there. I just want to hear kind of all about, I don't know, successes and failures and where those all kind of stack up against one another and what give you the kind of results that you like the most.
Yeah. I'll say after about 11 years of experimenting with plants, I can't think of one that we've used that really has any lasting antimicrobial power.
Okay.
We've, in some beers, and this is like experience from very early on because we don't do this anymore, but in the early days, in some of those non-hopped beers, we force carbed our beers. So we would let the fermentation go in primary, let's say a week or so, maybe 2 weeks at the most. And I'm talking about with the commercial yeast here, so not with the sourdough.
Gotcha.
Package it up into a keg and then force carb in the keg. We could see those beers retaining some quote unquote clean fermentation profile for a little while. But once they weren't cold anymore, they would always turn.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And then now we don't force carb anything. We keg condition or bottle condition everything. And so if there's anything in there, especially keeping it warm and going through secondary fermentation, it will come out. And there's nothing that I can think of that's ever really kept bacteria at bay other than hops.
Right.
I think some of those, and that's too, I mean, not pitching a commercial yeast. So, but with our sourdough culture, but so I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of variables, obviously, but I still would be willing to bet that even with a commercial pitch, there's just nothing like hops. And I think you can like get away with having it tasting a little bit more clean for a while if you just keep it cold and force carb and stuff like that. And so you can kind of have like a more pleasant, clean type of flavor that way. But yeah, if you're trying to make a shelf stable product or something that's going to last more than a couple weeks. I don't, yeah, there's just not much there, unfortunately. I've always had this dream, though, of making a non-hopped IPA because we have all of these amazing plants that grow around us that you could substitute for hops. Sassafras leaves are super tropical. The eastern red cedar, juniper that grows around us just has that piney aroma. There's like a handful of things we've used over the years that we always say when we brew those beers, wish we could just make a beer that we could pass off as an IPA and see if anybody would notice. But I think that the problem is the antibacterial side of things, because we could even get the bitterness from plants or plants that are bitter. And that's, I think, historically too, probably what a lot of those plants were used for, was more for the balancing of the malt, the sweetness of the malt, more so probably than the antimicrobial. And they were also drunk very often, very quickly. So kind of like I was saying with keeping it cold and forced carbing, that's also just, drinking quickly is going to keep the bacteria from forming. But anyway, yeah, we still might be able to pull off that IPA. I don't know. We'll see.
So an early beer, maybe the first scratch beer I had was Basil IPA, and it was good and revelatory. But that one has hops, correct? And then it just is also like aromatically dominated by basil. Is that accurate?
So that is a great beer and a good example of this. Like the hops in that beer are just bittering hops. So all of the aroma is actually coming from the basil. Awesome. So it has a pretty amazing IPA-like aroma, but it is all from the chemical compounds in the basil. And there's a lot of overlap. Stan Hieronymus has written about this in here and there in some of his books, but the chemical compounds in quite a few of the basils overlap with some of some hop compounds too. So it's no surprise that they're that it can give off a hop-like aroma. And the same thing is true of some of these other plants that I'm talking about. They actually share chemical compounds. So it just makes a lot of sense that they actually smell a lot like hops.
Definitely. With some of these herbal things, I went down a rabbit hole trying to, I feel like we often use alternately, talking about bitterness and astringency, and I think we kind of intuitively know the difference, but are there, and it seems like many of the ingredients that you'll be adding that, they're foraged or grown, have kind of one or the other. Is there any rhyme or reason to that, and any structured rhyme or reason towards their use for your beer? Like when you might, it feels like astringency is generally for beer what we're avoiding because we're so used to the kind of cleaner bitterness of the hop tradition. But are there things that exist kind of on a borderline case, or where you struggle to fall on one side or the other for those herbal additions or bark or whatever it may be?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that's a good point as far as like the balancing act for using plants, both apart from hops and also in addition to hops, because there is quite a bit of bitterness and or astringency that you can get from plants. And if a plant does have, let's just say if it is an especially bitter plant, we do usually dial back the hops in our beer. Now, we have also found that if we go too low on the hops, because we use a sourdough culture, I'm talking about for like a sourdough culture type of beer. If we go too low on the hops, it changes the fermentation profile. So generally speaking, if we're trying to go for like a clean profile, we add roughly at least 20 IBUs, but 25 to 30 is more of our sweet spot. If it goes like 10 or below, then you end up getting something that could potentially start to creep up to some acidity, or it's just actually not even quite bitter enough. So if we add a plant that's bitter, we dial back the hops, but then we don't want to dial it too low. Otherwise, it's not quite having the same antimicrobial effect anymore.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, but we are always balancing the bitterness and or astringency that we're getting from certain plants. And the idea of astringency too doesn't bother me so much, but then my palate might be a little bit more, used to drinking in these flavors
Sure.
uh, after so many years of working with them. But, yeah, having a different kind of bitterness, particularly if it's actually in combination with hops,
Hmm.
can actually add a little bit of complexity to the bitterness that you're getting on your tongue, you know. And I think too, with our sour beers, we tend not to make bitter sour beers. I don't really especially like the flavor of bitter and sour together so much.
Clash. Yeah. I think Clash
Yeah,
pretty good. Yeah.
yeah. So we're not using so many of those bittering with the sour beers. They're more like I think a good example is our dandelion ginger tonic, which dandelion is slightly bitter,
Hmm.
but used in the quantity that we use it, and then in combination with some of the other green stuff that we put into that beer, plus the fresh spiciness, light kind of floral quality of the fresh ginger that we use,
Hmm.
works well with a sour profile without skewing too much to the bitter side.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, so what percentage these days would you say outright unhopped beers are for scratch? It seems like, yeah, for many things you're targeting. Are those or do I have too old of information or
Oh,
does
yeah, I think
it
our
not
sour.
exist anymore?
No, we still definitely do. And actually, yeah, we like them, and I think our customers really like them too. So we've kept up with the sour beers for sure. I would say at least 30%, if not even close to 40 or so percent of our beers are sourdough culture beers. Yeah.
And how do you conceive of them maybe within the, I don't know, if if the brewery kind of maybe not lay person but uninitiated into making a lot of foraged beer would consider anything kind of unhopped to be of the gruit family and or tradition, how do you conceive of these as being part of that or outside of, or from a branding standpoint worthwhile to lean into that or lean away from?
Yeah, I think we kind of got away from using the word gruit because I felt like when people did know what a gruit was, which was, just
Infrequent.
for bearders for
Yeah.
everyone, honestly. When people did know what it was, sometimes they had an expectation of the kinds of herbs that would be used in it. And because our herbs are so different, I mean, even a beer like our, say, strawberry sumac, that is a non-hopped beer that, I suppose you could call it a gruit,
Mhm.
but it certainly doesn't have yarrow or bog myrtle or any of the kind of
Right.
like, classic bittering gruit herbs. So we kind of got out of the habit of using the word gruit and we just call those beers non-hopped beers or just, yeah, non-hopped sour beers. And then if somebody is super excited about gruit and comes into the tasting room, usually Aaron or I are there so we can geek out about them in
Yeah.
person. Yeah,
Yeah, you can, yeah, do a deep dive instead of, yeah, I
right,
guess drag everyone into that. The
right.
beer, right, presumably
Yeah,
tastes roughly the same,
yeah.
whatnot. It's called that. Um, I have a really niche side question that, is probably not helpful for the purposes of the podcast, but grapevine prunings, reading about these and mostly wild grapevines for reasons of not having, copper or worse sprayed on them.
Hmm.
But well, we're on a vineyard here, and I've got a lot of grapevine prunings and coming up shortly, and was real intrigued by their use. And if you guys have kept up with making those, actually, I think I saw, yeah, somewhat recently with, in conjunction with other parts of the vine, maybe grapes included. You guys have
Uh-huh.
done something recently, but wanted to know, I guess, especially specifically, I think in the Homebrewers Almanac, it was talking about like, it sounded like kind of woodier sections of it. And if you've used both kind of the thinner first year growth prunings versus the older woodier growth, or if you would steer clear of one or the other.
Oh my gosh, this is a whole world. We'll after the
We can do
podcast.
this later. Yeah.
No, it's amazing. It's so cool, actually. It's really fun. And yeah, I was down for the Terroir project thing down in Arizona this last year. And so we were geeking out about a lot of this stuff, which was so fun. But there's so much that you can get flavor-wise out of the grapevines, which is the last thing anybody thinks about. But I mean, you could make, a lot of people ask us, like, oh, how do you scale up some beers? And honestly, there are some ingredients that are in so much abundance on earth that you could make thousands and thousands of barrels, and grapevines are just a perfect example. So we've used everything you could possibly think of. The like younger green clippings, they really have more of a like soft white grape kind of flavor. They're so cool. We put everything into the boil. So, like at 60, you put those in and you're just going to pull out so much of that white grape flavor. You do get a little bit of, I think of it as like a tannic type of bitterness. So maybe somewhere on the borderline of bitter astringent, but kind of the tannin side of it. And so, it will add a little bit of that, bitter mouthfeel on your tongue, but in a good way. So like post fermentation, like let's say the beer that we very often make with it is just a classic saison. In a saison style fermentation, you end up with something that really conveys like a white wine type of character in a beer without one grape in the entire thing. You can get a similar flavor profile out of older growth type of vines. What we've found really interesting with that, so like if we're trying to focus on pulling out the grape type character out of a vine, the early growth is good. But you can also get, let's call it more like the darker red stone fruity type of stuff that you can get out of grapes from the older vines. So the vines that we're using are wild grapevines that grow in the woods around the brewery. They're just littered with them. So I mean, you'll be out there and you'll find these enormous old wild grapevines. Some of them come down on trees, and they, that's when we prefer to use them then, because they sort of die with the tree.
Right.
And some of these are like 30, 40 years old. They're enormous. And if you cut them up into sections, the first thing you'll notice when you cut them up is that there is just like, tons of like sugars that are running through these vines that we're keeping them alive. If you toast those in the oven, it will instantly start to caramelize. It'll just start to, heat will pull it out of the vine, and then it'll caramelize on the vine. And the toasting process, and this is kind of like what we do with our hickory bark. The toasting process adds a woody incense-like character. That's something that we get from a lot of our bark beers. So the vine is getting that, but it's also getting this caramelized grape sugar, maybe I would call it. So you're also getting this kind of caramel stone fruit type of thing out of the sugars that are in the vine. We actually do also we'll toast that and put that in the boil as well. Not for 60, I don't know, maybe like 10 or something like that.
To keep as much of that flavor, presumably.
Right.
Flavor and or aroma. Yeah.
Right. Without maybe over extracting.
Right.
And so we just made this beer actually towards the end of last year, and we have it in bottles right now. And what's cool about it, especially using the right amount, because obviously that does sound like it could be fairly overpowering if you use a lot, but used it in a beer where we combined the young growth with some old growth and toasted the bark or the vine itself, which we don't always do, but we wanted to with this one. And you get the toasted vine. It almost approximates oak aging.
Hmm.
When you taste this beer, you're almost tricked into thinking that this is an oak aged beer, but it's not. It's the toasted grapevine. So it kind of has this like, caramel vanillin type of aroma to it. But then the grape note underneath, and it's just a nice kind of effervescent saison. Yeah, it's kind of
And
like
that's
best.
and that's still from just using that wood in the boil, not from a post conditioning
Exactly. Yep.
period.
In oil. Yeah.
Yeah, I was in reading, reading the Homebrewers Almanac, struck by, wine, modern industrial wineries have given me kind of a distaste for oak cubes or chips or spirals or
Right.
worse, like, the kind of oak sawdust that sometimes winemakers will use. But
Right.
thinking about like, yeah, you guys taking sections of oak off of your own property
Yeah.
and using those,
Yeah.
I was like, oh, that makes so much sense. It always just felt like like a bad simulacrum of the oak barrel, but not at all. When
Right.
that's the whole project, is to make use of your
You're right.
environs as best as one can.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Um, are are there a handful of beers for those who hopefully have heard this and are, just real now thirsty for scratch beer? Are there a handful of beers that you feel like are most emblematic of scratch? I know to me the beauty is in the kind of diversity of
Hmm.
what you find in your local environment, and then including your beers. But are there some kind of standouts or closer to flagship beers, or at least ones that you just have to make year after year, because they're simply too good and beloved?
Yeah, I think actually a lot of the ones that we've mentioned, so the basil IPA that you're talking about, which we've even considered changing it to just be basil ale, taking the IPA out because
Mm,
IPA is such a fraught
yeah.
category. And I don't even know if I would call it an IPA or if it even ever was. It just, projects hops to you. So that's the intention, is we're just trying to like make you think about hops when you're drinking the basil. But anyway, that's a
Mm,
really neat one. I think like sort of on the farmed end of things that we grow, interesting things that you can get out of common farmed ingredients. That basil beer is a great example, and it's a very drinkable beer.
very
The
much so.
Chanterelle Bière de Garde, which we sort of mentioned in passing,
Yeah.
that's the very first beer that we bottled at scratch, and we
Mhm.
continue to make it every year, at least when we can find enough mushrooms.
Right.
I think of that one as probably the one that's most emblematic of what our brewery is, smells like, tastes like, just the essence of scratch, this beautiful mushroom that grows just 20 feet behind our brew house that we strive to harvest every year. It has these really fascinating flavors that work really well with that style. It's supposed to be kind of integrated into the style in a way that plays with the style. That history of Bière de Garde is, they were very often held in cellars with corks, and these corks got kind of a mushroomy sort
Hmm.
of aroma over time. And we were playing with that idea by adding chanterelles to convey this mushroom character. But the chanterelles too, they're like apricot and earth and have this, I don't mean this in a bad way, but kind of like a buttery sort of
Hmm.
mushroom
Yeah,
aroma.
distinctly non-diacetyl, but of
Right.
yeah.
Exactly. So yeah, I think that one is, that's one of our most beloved beers, I think. And the dandelion ginger tonic. This is always
Mm.
the time of year that we start thinking about that beer, because it's, the winter is starting to end here. It's
Quick.
75
Yeah.
degrees today. I can hardly believe it.
Yeah.
We're looking out the window thinking, when are we going to be able to harvest the first stuff out of the ground? Well, the very first beer that we do as soon as we can harvest anything out of the ground is the Chanterelle Bière de Garde. I mean, sorry, the dandelion ginger tonic.
Mhm.
It just tastes like the spring. The ginger is just invigorating, yeah. That one we do every year too. And the single tree hickory, which you started on, I
Yeah.
think too, says a lot about the place where we are. Our woods are just full of hickory trees. If you ever come out to Scratch in the fall, you hear hickory nuts falling from the trees onto the roof of the pavilion. Um, People who come out to drink have that experience. They feel really connected to this tree that they're sitting under. So it's amazing too to we almost always have a hickory beer on of some kind of sassafras too. Those two trees are probably the most prominent in the woods behind us. They are two trees that are very emblematic of where our brewery is located. And yeah, toasting the bark and using it in that way it's a really novel drinking experience the first time you have it. And I really think it makes you think about how ingredients can be utilized in a new way in beer, in an unusual way. That single tree hickory it's a sour beer too. Our sourdough culture is in that one. There's no hops in that one. All the aromas coming from this tree from our brewery. The grain is from Sugar Creek. For me, that beer is very much about our place in the country where we are.
I've noticed a maybe like kind of nearly global, I don't know if it's a phenomenon, maybe I'm just looking for it and there's some confirmation bias, but people who are kind of iconoclasts in their field, frequently rural because that's where you're able to do it. Where so much of the farmhouse beer tract is about the power of locality, but it can sometimes be that when you visit Danny Prignon in Belgium, the locals don't care, and it's only people traveling a great distance because he's been steadfast in making decidedly weird beer of his place for as long as I've been alive. And so I see this, I'm just using him as an example, but where sometimes try as we might, it's when you're already thinking about like how do I from all local, like we care about making something of our own place, but if the drinkers would prefer if they would prefer it to be more homogenized,
right.
just want you to be a watering hole. How do you find that to a degree? I would it wouldn't surprise me, but I want to put that, I haven't visited the brewery yet.
Right.
We certainly experience it. But yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'd love to hear your experience actually. It's a mix. It's definitely a mix. There are people who live in Ava, population 700 people, who don't know about Scratch. So
Right.
there's that. But on the other hand, like we have the greatest neighbors on earth. Like, I don't know, we just have the best neighbors, and
Wonderful.
they not all of them were craft beer drinkers before we opened, but they come every single week for a pizza and a beer.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a mix. You can't win everybody over for sure, but
Right.
I'm also, proud that our space, which is like you're saying, yes, it is in a very rural part of the country. And I feel like our space is really open, and there's a very wide demographic that comes in our doors, and everybody can drink together. No matter where they're from or what their background is or their political persuasion. So I'm glad that we are an open watering hole in that sense, that there are a lot of people passing through each other's lives in our doors.
That's wonderful. What continues to, I guess, inspire for you and for Aaron at Scratch today? What what is what's keeping you going and pushing the boundaries even from where you're at, knowing that as it is, it's you guys are doing a beautiful thing in the world. But yeah,
Yeah.
but what's
How do you
next?
how do you keep going?
Yeah.
Um,
What keeps it interesting and makes you want to keep going. Obviously, walking in the woods for ingredients has got to be pretty nice, but it's got to be
yeah,
a good grounding experience. But
right. Coming on 11 years, we're not doing as much experimentation as we did in the early days. So it's not so much about experimenting anymore. Um, but that said, we're still brewing beers every week that we haven't brewed before. And I think
very cool.
always being seasonal and never ever having a flagship has allowed us to when it's basil season, we make the basil beer. When basil season's over, we don't have to worry about it again. And
Yeah,
then when basil season comes around the next year, we're actually kind of excited to make that beer again because we haven't had it in a year. So
yeah,
I actually,
that's a good timeline. Yeah, that
yeah,
the earth is imposed on us. Yeah,
right. It actually makes the brewer really excited to come in to work because it doesn't feel so much like work. It's a ton of work, but it's not so rote. And then so on top of that, then also we're still making beers with our ingredients that we haven't made before. Like a lot of times one of us will come in and say, did we ever make a lager with, rose hips and honey before? Like, and the other person be like, I don't think so. No, that sounds good. All right, well, let's try it. You know, that's
yeah,
like most definitely a typical Wednesday, the beginning of a brew day at Scratch. So that definitely keeps it interesting to keep trying new things. But apart from that, I think Aaron and I both also have a lot of other interests. We're both kind of history nerds to some degree. And, he's been researching a lot of his family's history with apples, and I've been researching a lot of my family's history with Norwegian foodways. And, that those interests, even though they don't sound like brewing interests per se, there's always stuff that we get out of looking away from beer for a little while that helps to inform our beer when we look back at the beer. So I think having like a healthy balance of other interests, can allow you to see beer in a different way, which I think is sort of how we started this whole experiment in the first place. I mean, Aaron has a degree in photography and mine is English and philosophy. So I think we're both like humanities people that have a very different way of looking at beer, and being able to keep nurturing that stuff helps us to stay invigorated because we can still think about beer in a different way.
yeah, and I feel like it's easy for brewers, I don't know, to get a little insular or
Yeah.
just kind of just borrowing from one another, which is great and collegial to a point. But anytime somebody can bring in an outside perspective or influence, I feel like we're all probably gradually a little richer for it.
Yeah, for sure. I agree.
It's about all the time we have. So thank you so much, Marika, for this lovely conversation. Thanks
Thanks,
for
James. It was great.
indulging all of the, sometimes tangential questions. Um, Mark will be back on the next episode of the show as the host, having a conversation with the brewer of her choosing. That will be on the air in 2 weeks, so make sure you tune in for that. Visit allaboutbeer.com and follow on social media. And to support journalism in the beer space, check out patreon.com/allaboutbeer. I'm James Priest of The Referend. Thank you for listening to the Brewer to Brewer podcast.
First Tea is a proud sponsor of the Brewer to Brewer podcast. First Tea invites you to explore the rich and versatile world of teas and botanicals, including osmanthus flowers. Email info@firsttea.com, that's FIRSDTEA, for support in choosing the right botanicals and the optimal ways to use them.
Ironheart Canning is the quality leader in mobile canning and much more. With a decade of packaging experience, Ironheart is your turnkey solution for all your canning needs. Are you looking for a unique can size or nitro dosing? Ironheart offers filling sizes from 6 ounce up to 19.2, dedicated equipment for mixed culture products, and nitro dosing capabilities for still beverages and beer. Looking to break into other beverage segments? Look no further. Ironheart also provides a robust network of co-packing solution to get a variety of beverages in cans, both alcoholic and non-alcoholic alike. Ironheart Canning. You have the capability because Ironheart can do it for you. Visit them at ironheartcanning.com or email info@ironheartcanning.com.
For more than a decade, the Beer Law Center has been dedicated to the craft beverage industry, meeting the legal needs of breweries, wineries, distilleries, and all manner of alcohol producers and sellers around the country. From company formation to federal and state licensing, trademarks, regulations, and compliance, or if you're buying or selling an alcohol business, the Beer Law Center should be your first call. The firm never charges for an initial consultation, and if they can't help you, they'll help you find someone that can. Have a legal question? Contact the Beer Law Center on social media at Beer Law Center and online at beerlawcenter.com.
Malteurop Malting Company is based in North America, specializing in growing and producing quality malts for the craft beer and distilling industries. With local farms and malt houses spread across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, MMC's commitment to excellence is fully ingrained into every batch it produces, ensuring breweries and distilleries of any size can create the finest beverages on the planet. Visit malteuropmaltingco.com to learn how Malt Europe can support your malting needs. Or you can contact them at customer success at malteurope.com or call 844-546-MALT for questions or to place your order. Malt Europe, premium grains from field to flavor.